Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Tonight, we invite you to settle into a warm, quiet space. Let your shoulders soften, your breath slow down, and your thoughts drift like leaves on a calm river. There's no rush here, no noise, just the soft rhythm of storytelling, whispered through time, carried gently on the wind. You don't need to do anything but listen. Perhaps you're already tucked into bed, the lights low, and the night stretching softly around you. Or maybe you're curled up on the sofa with a cup of tea, letting the day dissolve into calm. Wherever you are, however you feel, you're safe here. This is your moment. This is your quiet. Tonight's tale takes us back to Middle-earth, far beyond the tall hills of the Shire, and past the darkened ruins of Mordor. But it's not a tale of war, nor of power. It's something quieter, deeper. A story carried in silence, spoken only in whispers. A hobbit, young and gentle, begins to hear something no one else can. A voice, ancient and heavy, calling from the sleeping fire of Mount Doom. What follows is not a battle, but a journey inward. One step at a time, through memory, through echo, through the quiet language of the earth. So close your eyes if you like. Let your breath match the rhythm of the story. Let your heartbeat slow to the pace of soft footsteps over moss and stone. There will be no loud turns, no startling twists, just the slow unfolding of a tale told by firelight, for dreamers and wanderers, and those who find peace in listening. We begin now with the hobbit who could hear the whispers of Mount Doom. Let the story guide you into rest, in the quiet corners of the Shire, where the hills rolled like the soft folds of a green quilt, and the smell of pipeweed drifted lazily in the wind. Lived a young hobbit named Tomlo Proudfoot. Tomlo was like any other hobbit, fond of breakfast, second breakfast, and supper, and he rarely ventured beyond the bounds of hobbitdom. He had curly chestnut hair, a round, dimpled face, and a fondness for mushroom pie that rivaled even that of old Farmer Maggot. Yet, unlike most hobbits, who slept deeply and dreamlessly, Tomlo had begun to wake in the middle of the night with a chill in his spine and an echo in his ears. The first time it happened, he thought it was just the wind sighing through the shutters. But it happened again, and again, each time clearer than before. The voice that stirred him did not sound like anything he knew. It was low, ancient, and strange, half whisper, half rumble, like the voice of the earth itself murmuring in its sleep. It said no words he could understand at first, only tones, long, sorrowful tones that vibrated in his chest. But over time the whispers sharpened. He began to pick out something like his name, stretched and drawn out like a breath over hot coals. Doom, doo. The voice seemed to come from far away, yet it arrived as if it had bypassed wind and weather to speak directly into his bones. He tried to forget it during the day, losing himself in gardening, visiting friends, or walking along the water. But when night fell, so did silence. And in silence, the whisper returned. At first, he said nothing to anyone. Hobbits were not fond of tales involving strange voices and far-off lands. and Tomlo himself was uncertain whether he was dreaming or falling ill. But his eyes began to darken with worry, and Mrs. Bramblebur, the baker's wife, noticed how he often stopped mid-sentence to glance eastward. "Storms coming from that way?" she asked one morning, dusting flour from her apron. Tomlo shook his head, but said nothing. What could he say? That he was being called in the night by something ancient and forgotten? That in the comfort of his bed, he heard not dreams but summons? No, the Shire was no place for strange thoughts, and so he kept them locked behind his teeth. The only one he dared speak to was old Samwise Gamgee, now well into his twilight years, but still sharp-eyed and warm-hearted. Sam had seen more of the world than any other hobbit still living, and was not easily unsettled by odd tales. Tomlo visited him one crisp autumn evening, when the trees had turned to fire, and the air smelled of apples and earth. They sat beside the hearth in Bag End, where the fire crackled gently, and the shadows on the walls danced like ancient spirits. Tomlo spoke slowly, haltingly at first, but Sam listened without interruption, his wrinkled hands wrapped around a mug of tea. When the tale was done, Sam sat silent for a long time. "There are old powers in this world," Sam said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "Most are gone, some are sleeping, and some..." He trailed off, eyes distant. "Some remember." He reached into a small wooden chest and pulled out a thin silver chain. On it hung a smooth, dark stone. "Frodo once wore this," he said. "It's not the ring, no, just something to remind him of the journey. But when he left for the west, he left it with me." Tomlo took it with trembling fingers, and for a moment the air around him seemed to grow still. The whispers fell silent. "You might be hearing echoes of what once was," Sam continued. "Mordor may be quiet now, but the earth remembers fire." That night, Tomlo held the pendant close as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He did not sleep easily, but the voice was fainter than before, like it had receded to the edge of the world. Still, it returned before dawn, gentler this time, almost coaxing. There was no threat in it, only longing. The voice did not drag him from his dreams. It waited patiently, and Tomlo, for reasons he could not name, listened. With each passing night, the whisper became clearer, fragments of words, sorrowful phrases, the impression of heat, ash, and time uncounted. He saw in dreams the silhouette of a mountain with fire in its belly. He saw stone blackened with ancient soot, and always he heard that whisper, "Tomlo." By the time winter crept over the hills and laid its first frost on the grass, Tomlo had changed. He was still the same hobbit to most eyes, but something in him had shifted. The world beyond the Shire had begun to call him, and the earth beneath his feet no longer felt like the end of things, but the beginning. He took to reading old books, many borrowed from the archives in Michel Delving, about Mordor, about Frodo's journey, and about the ring that had once held all of Middle-earth in fear. The more he read, the more the whispers began to make sense. The voice, he suspected, came from Mount Doom itself, Orodruin, the mountain of fire that had once forged and unmade the One Ring. A place dead and buried in the minds of hobbits, but not in the memory of stone. And so the idea took root in his heart. Perhaps the mountain remembered the ones who had come before. Perhaps it recognized something in him, some trace of the ring's power left behind in the world. Perhaps it sought not to ensnare him, but to speak through him. Tomlo did not know if he was being summoned to danger or to healing, but he knew with a certainty he could not shake that he had to go. The Shire would always be his home, but the world was wider than its hedges and hills. He could no longer turn away from the east. Something waited there for him, not darkness, but truth. That decision did not come in a rush of excitement or youthful fantasy. It came gently, like a sunrise through mist. One morning, he packed a small satchel with seed cakes, a flask of cold tea, a map he copied by hand, and the pendant Sam had given him. He left a note on his round wooden table that simply read, "Gone walking, don't worry, we'll be back before the grass turns green again." And with that, Tomlo stepped out of his round front door and onto the road. The sky was grey, and the breeze carried the scent of leaves and distant memory. He did not look back. Ahead lay eastward paths, forgotten lands, and the whisper of a mountain with stories yet untold. He left Bree the next morning before the frost had melted from the shutters. Eastward, the land grew quiet and watchful. The green hills gave way to open country, and then to the weathered plains, where once armies had marched in black armor. Few folk lived in those parts now. Tomlo traveled carefully, often sleeping beneath hedges or inside hollow tree trunks. The voice, however, never left him. It whispered now in words he understood, slow, heavy syllables that hinted not at power, but pain. Forgotten, still burning, must be ended. The pendant around his neck warmed sometimes, as if responding. He began to realize this journey was not just about her hearing the voice. It was about understanding it, and perhaps answering it. The road eastward wound gently out of the Shire, across fields gilded by winter's breath, and through thickets where the trees murmured in the old tongue of rustling leaves. Tomlo walked with quiet determination, his heart a steady drumbeat beneath his woolen vest. Though he was small and his legs short, hobbits are sturdier than they look, and Tomlo made good time. He passed the Brandywine River with only a brief pause, watching the morning mist swirl over the slow water like a curtain. It felt as though the world was shifting with him, each step pulling him further not only from home, but from the person he had always believed himself to be. With each mile, the whisper grew more distinct, less haunting, more curious, like a question forming slowly in the dark. By the time he reached Bree, the whisper had begun to echo, not just in his sleep, but even in the quiet hours of the afternoon. He could sense it like a breeze beneath the noise of the market, under the clink of mugs in the prancing pony. It was not a sound so much as a presence, something that brushed against his thoughts when he was still. In Bree, he asked about old stories. The barkeep, a grizzled man with eyes like boiled marbles, told him the tales that remained, of the 9 riders, of the fall of Barad-dûr, and of the ring-bearers who walked into fire. But none of it answered the questions that stirred in Tomlo's heart. That night, lying in a modest room above the common room, the voice came again, clearer, closer. "You carry what was touched," it murmured, as if through a wall of heat. "You carry memory." It was in the ruined village of Estelbar, an overgrown remnant of a time when rangers watched the wilds, that Tomlo found a journal in the wreckage of an old stone house. The pages were brittle but legible, filled with the ranger's musings from a time long past. One entry spoke of a sliver of stone found near the fires of Orodruin, kept hidden, for it hums at night and whispers in the tongue of lost kings. Tomlo felt a chill as he read it. Could such a fragment have found its way west, toward the safety of peaceful lands? Could it have been kept, unknowingly, by those who wished only to preserve history? He remembered the museum in Michel Delving, the smooth black shard on a velvet cloth. He had touched it once as a child, felt a thrum in his fingertips. Was that where this began? He walked in silence for 2 more days, the whisper now deepening, becoming something more than a call. It was turning into a plea. Bring it. End it. The mountain, he was beginning to believe, was not calling out of malice or hunger. It was tired. It was old. It wanted release. Tomlo found himself moved not by fear, but compassion. What did it mean for a mountain to remember sorrow? Could stone grieve? Each night he looked toward the distant horizon, wondering how much farther he must go before the mountain rose before him like a dark memory made real. And yet, even with the weight of it pressing on his thoughts, he felt no dread, only purpose. By the time he reached the edges of what had once been Ithilien, the sky had taken on a strange hue. The stars here were not as bright, and the land seemed hushed, as though waiting for something. The ruins of old watchtowers stood like broken teeth, and the trees whispered, not in the voice of the mountain, but of old battles and fading hope. In one such grove, he met a figure cloaked in grey light, neither man nor elf, but something in between. The figure did not speak at first. It simply watched Tomlo with eyes like moonlit silver. Then, as the wind rustled the leaves overhead, it said in a voice like running water, "You carry the echo of the ring." Tomlo stepped back, but the figure raised no threat, only sadness. That night, Tomlo did not sleep. He sat beside the embers of a small fire and listened, not just to the whisper of the mountain, but to the quiet of the land itself. He began to understand. The voice he heard was not the mountain alone, but a song of everything the ring had touched. The echo of Frodo's burden, of Sam's loyalty, of Gollum's madness, and of Sauron's hunger. It all lingered, trapped in stone and ash, and through some twist of fate or memory, it had found him. A hobbit with no great power, no special lineage, only a heart that had brushed, however lightly, against a relic that should have never remained. "I don't carry power," Tomlo replied softly. "Only memory, perhaps." The figure nodded slowly. "That is sometimes the heavier burden," it said. "Mordor may have fallen, but not all that it touched has crumbled. The mountain was forged to make, not destroy, and it cannot forget." The figure stepped closer, extending a hand that glowed faintly. "If you would help it sleep, you must go on, but know this, the fire remembers all. You will be shown not what you are, but what you could become." Tomlo took the figure's hand. For a moment, the warmth of it chased the cold from his chest. Then the figure faded, like mist in morning light. As dawn broke across the broken towers and forgotten paths, Tomlo rose. The east called to him, no longer as a mystery, but as a responsibility. He did not know how the journey would end, whether the mountain would embrace him or burn him. But he knew he must go. The path was no longer merely his to walk. It belonged to the world, to its memory, and to the quiet hope that perhaps, in this age of peace, the last whisper of the old fire could finally fall silent. The further Tomlo travelled eastward, the more the land changed beneath his feet. grass grew thinner and sparser, and the trees gave way to broken stumps and twisted shrubs that seemed to claw at the sky. Gone were the comforting sounds of birdsong or the rustle of small woodland creatures. Here, even the wind whispered differently, dry, brittle, as if it scraped against bones buried long ago. The sun, though still bright in the sky, seemed distant and pale. And in the distance, like a blackened tooth rising from the throat of the world, the peak of Mount Doom had begun to show itself. It was smaller than the mountains of the north, yet it pressed on the horizon with a terrible weight, casting an invisible shadow that stretched farther than any mountain should. Though Tomlo had always imagined Mordor as a place of dread and darkness, what he found was a silence that ached. The black gate had long since fallen, crumbled into heaps of stone and iron, but its memory lingered in the surrounding cliffs. The path that led through what once had been the heart of Sauron's empire was now nothing but rubble, ash, and the ruins of twisted towers, long stripped by wind and time. Yet the voice, his guide and his burden, grew clearer with every step. It no longer whispered, but breathed. Closer. Remember. Complete. The words held no command. They were not coercive. Instead, they seemed like fragments of a dream, longing to be understood. A memory trying to finish itself through him. Tomlo walked carefully through the edges of Gorgoroth, the desolate plain where once the armies of the Dark Lord had camped in endless rows. Now the plain was cracked and empty, with only the occasional sign of old battle. A rusted blade buried in blackened soil, or a stone carved faintly with the mark of the eye, half eroded by time. Each night, he made camp among rocks shaped by forgotten fire, sleeping beneath a sky choked with thin clouds that never rained. The stars here were faint, like they, too, feared to watch this part of the world. But even here, in this stillness, he did not feel alone. The mountains spoke in murmurs through the soil, not with menace but with longing, like something trapped that had waited too long for someone to listen. On the third night after crossing into Mordor's heart, Tomlo found a half-collapsed stone outpost, built long ago by Gondorian watchmen after the fall of the Dark Lord. It was now home to nothing but dust and lizards. He lit a small fire in the hearth, though there was little wood to find, and sat in the silence, holding the pendant Sam had given him. It had grown warm again. He thought of Frodo then, not the great hero sung in songs, but the Hobbit, small and tired, who had once stood on the brink of this very mountain. What thoughts had passed through his mind? What weight had he carried, not just on his neck, but in his soul? Tomlo closed his eyes, and for a moment it felt as if he were not alone in his skin. He felt a sadness, old and aching, like the echo of a scream swallowed by fire. The next day brought him closer to the base of the mountain. The ground was dark with ancient ash, and strange sulphurous scents drifted up from cracks in the stone. Yet despite its ominous past, the mountain no longer roared. There was no smoke, no tremble of the earth. Mount Doom had fallen into stillness, its fires long cooled into slumber. But within that slumber was a pulse. Not life, not as one would call it, but memory. Tomlo could feel it beneath each step, a steady rhythm, as if the mountain itself had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat now synchronized with his own. "You've come," the whisper said that night, not from the wind or the air, but from the very stone beneath his feet. "You remember. You bring what was taken." Tomlo found no door, no marked entrance, only narrow paths of broken rock that curled up toward the peak. He began the slow climb in the early hours, beneath a pale sky. Each step was slow, deliberate. The mountain was not tall, but it was steep, and its edges were sharp. His hands bled more than once, scraped raw by jagged stone. Yet he climbed, driven not by fear nor glory, but by something quieter, the need to give rest to a place that had known only fire and torment. As he neared a jagged ridge that overlooked the plain, the air grew warm, not burning, but strangely alive, as if some spirit still lingered in the rocks, watching him with ancient eyes. He paused, breathless, and listened. The voice came again, but this time with sorrow. They broke it, but I remain. I remember, through you. Suddenly, his thoughts were no longer his own. A vision overtook him, vivid and consuming. He saw Frodo, ragged and pale, standing at the edge of the fire with the ring held aloft. He saw Gollum, mad with hunger, biting through finger and bone. He saw fire leap as the ring fell, and the mountain roar in pain, not rage. Then he saw silence, centuries of silence, the fire fading, the echo dwindling, until one day a boy, a hobbit, touched a shard in a museum, and the mountain stirred, not to reclaim power, but to find meaning again. Tomlo gasped as the vision faded. Tears streamed down his cheeks, not from pain, but from the weight of what he now knew. The mountain did not call him to awaken evil. It called him to complete the forgetting. He reached the summit as dusk painted the sky in violet and soot grey. The crater was no longer molten, but filled with black stone, cracked and cold. He stood at its edge and removed the pendant. It pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat bidding farewell. Then, with both hands, Tomlo let it fall into the pit. It struck the stone below with a soft sound, almost like a sigh. The ground beneath him was still. The wind stopped. And then, for the first time since he had left the Shire, the voice fell silent. Not buried, not suppressed, simply quiet, peacefully, finally quiet. Tomlo stood there for a long while, watching the fading light settle on the world's scar. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel heroic. He felt light, as if he had carried a sorrow that was never his, and had now given it back. The journey was not one of grand battles, or songs to be sung in taverns. It was a journey of listening, of remembrance. And now, with the final whisper laid to rest, Tomlo turned away from the mountain, the fire behind him extinguished at last. The way home would be long, but his heart was still, and the road, though silent, welcomed his steps. Tomlo descended the mountain slowly, his footsteps quiet against the brittle rock. The wind, once sharp with heat and ancient voices, now moved softly through the air, no longer burdened with whispers. Where once a great fire had raged within the heart of the world, now only stone remained, still, solemn, and at peace. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, like the final note of a long-forgotten song echoing into dusk. Tomlo felt no triumph. The pendant was gone. The voice had fallen silent. But what lingered within him was not the absence of sound. It was the echo of meaning. Something sacred had passed through him, and though it left no mark on his skin, it had changed the shape of his soul. As he left the upper ridges of Orodruin, his hands still raw from the climb, Tomlo found that the land itself seemed to breathe differently. The sky stretched wider, the air lighter, as if the mountain's stillness had sent a message into the world beyond. For the first time in many days, birds returned to the edges of the horizon. Small, cautious things flitting between withered trees like scouts of hope. Though Mordor was still a land scarred by fire and grief, Tomlo saw now that the scars no longer bled. The land did not heal quickly nor loudly, but it healed. And in that slow restoration, he sensed something sacred, something earned. He camped that night at the foot of the mountain, wrapped in his worn cloak, and watched the stars emerge overhead. They were brighter here now, as if daring to return. In the quiet hours of that night, he dreamt not of fire, but of the Shire, of green fields swaying under lazy sunlight, of second breakfasts and warm hearths, and old stories told over steaming mugs. But woven into that dream was something new. The face of Frodo Baggins, not as a hero, but as a tired hobbit, smiling gently, nodding once before turning into the mist. When Tomlo woke, the dawn was gentle and golden, painting the black stone in soft hues. The mountain loomed behind him, its great shadow cast westward, but it no longer frightened him. It watched, perhaps, but with the weary gaze of something no longer seeking to speak. There was peace in that silence, and Tomlo carried it with him as he began his return across the dark plain. The journey back through Gorgoroth was no less difficult than before, but now it felt different. Where once the landscape had seemed hostile and weighted with memory, now it felt quiet in its own right, like a resting battlefield after centuries of noise. Tomlo passed the same twisted remnants, the same blackened soil and fallen towers, but no voices clung to them anymore. The silence was complete and somehow kind. He paused near a familiar outcrop where he had camped on his way in, and he saw now what he hadn't before. A small flower blooming between cracks in the stone, pale and trembling but alive. He knelt beside it, brushing a finger against the petal, and smiled at it. Even here, life found a way to speak again. Further west, as the dark earth began to give way to green once more, Tomlo came across an old man by a stream, tending to a bent fishing rod and a kettle of tea set upon warm stone. The man's beard was white and long, and his cloak shimmered faintly, though the morning mist clung to it without wetting it. Tomlo hesitated, then approached, drawn by the smell of mint and honey in the tea. The man looked up, eyes twinkling. "You've come from the east," he said softly. It was not a question. Tomlo nodded and sat when the man gestured. They shared tea in silence for a while, the old man offering no name, no history, and Tomlo not asking. But before they parted, the man offered only this. Sometimes, to quiet the world, one must first learn to carry its noise. You've done well. Tomlo continued on, the memory of the encounter lingering in his mind like a leaf caught in a breeze. He thought then of Samwise Gamgee and wondered if the old gardener had ever walked back toward that fire in his dreams, or if he too had heard echoes that could not be shared. It was one thing to carry memory, Tomlo realized, and another to be changed by it. He did not know what he would say to those back home, nor if they would understand. But it no longer troubled him. Some stories were not meant to be told aloud. Some were meant only to be felt and carried, like embers that warmed the heart without needing flame. He would bring that warmth home, and that would be enough. As he re-entered the lands beyond Mordor's edge, he passed a patrol of Gondorian rangers. They eyed him with mild surprise, for few ventured near those cursed lands, and fewer returned. One of them, a woman with a bow taller than Tomlo himself, offered him bread and water and asked what had brought him so far east. Tomlo simply said, "I was called to remember something the mountain had forgotten." She didn't press. Perhaps she too had walked through places where memory lingered like mist, and knew that not all answers were for sharing. She nodded once, offered him a thin smile, and pointed him toward a path that would lead him safely toward Ithilien. "The woods are quiet now," she said, "and healing. You'll be safe from here." By the time he reached the borders of Emin Arnen, the air was sweet with pine and wild thyme. Trees arched overhead, filtering the sunlight into quiet patterns across the earth. Tomlo felt the shift, not only in the land, but within himself. The further he walked, the more the heat of memory settled into calmness, like a stone cooling after being pulled from the fire. He passed shepherds and farmhands who greeted him with curious smiles, and though he nodded kindly in return, he kept walking. It would still be many days before he reached the Shire, but the weight of the journey no longer pressed heavily upon him. Instead, he walked lightly, step by step, the memory of the mountain resting behind him like a distant dream, gently fading into the blue. Tomlo arrived at the edges of the Shire in the soft light of early evening. The hedgerows shimmered with dew, and fireflies blinked lazily in the tall grass. It was late summer, and the fields were thick with golden barley, swaying like a gentle sea beneath a peach-coloured sky. The smell of pipeweed drifted through the air from the windows of hobbit holes tucked into the hillsides. Birds chirped merrily, as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong in a place like this. Yet for Tomlo, something felt different. Not wrong, not broken, just quieter. The world hadn't changed, but he had. The soil beneath his feet no longer sang the same tune. He loved it still, but with a love that had been deepened by distance, by loss, and by listening to places that had long forgotten how to sing. He made his way to the edge of Bywater, walking slowly along the path lined with berry bushes and wildflowers. The old stone markers were just where he remembered them, though they seemed smaller now, as if the road had grown in his absence. Children played by the brook, chasing frogs and laughing, and a baker's cart passed him on the lane, its driver humming a song about lemon tarts and early harvests. Tomlo smiled and nodded to them all, but he did not stop. He carried no fanfare, no medals or titles, only the dust of Mordor on his boots, and the memory of a mountain that had spoken with longing through stone. That was enough for him. When he reached his garden gate, he paused, brushing his fingers across the worn wood. It creaked open as it always had, welcoming him home without question. Inside his home, everything remained just as he had left it. The small round door opened into a warm, tidy sitting room with books stacked beside the hearth and a soft armchair tucked under the window. The scent of lavender still lingered in the air, from sachets he had tied in the corners last spring. He sat slowly, letting the chair sigh beneath his weight, and looked around. Nothing had changed, and yet nothing felt quite the same. He reached into his pack and drew out the folded piece of cloth where the pendant had once been wrapped. It was empty now, only the fabric remained. He placed it gently on the mantel and stared at it for a long time. The silence in the room was thick, not oppressive, but sacred. He did not rush to fill it with music or chatter. Instead, he let it sit there with him. An old friend returned. The following morning, Tomlo went walking. He passed familiar places, the Green Dragon Inn, where laughter spilled through the open windows, the market square, where vendors cheerfully argued over the price of pickles and strawberries, and the post house, where letters from Bree or Tuckborough waited in neat bundles. Neighbours waved and called out to him with cheerful surprise. "Back from your adventure, are you, Tomlo?" one said, grinning as he hauled a basket of tomatoes. "Did you find any dwarven treasure?" asked another, a child with muddy boots and wide eyes. Tomlo smiled politely, shook his head, and simply said, "No treasure, just a long walk." That answer seemed to satisfy them, though some shook their heads in amusement. A hobbit with wanderlust was always something to be gently laughed at, not feared. But none pressed further, and for that he was grateful. That evening, he visited Samwise Gamgee's old garden, now cared for by his daughter Eleanor. The flowers still bloomed as brightly as ever. Roses, marigolds, and sweet-smelling thyme all dancing in the breeze. Eleanor greeted him warmly, inviting him to tea beneath the ivy-covered trellis. She had her father's steady gaze and her mother's kindness. "You've changed," she said softly, pouring honey into his cup without asking. "Something in your eyes is quiet now." Tomlo hesitated, then nodded. "I heard something, far away. And now that I've returned, I carry it with me." Eleanor said nothing for a long while. Then she reached across the table, touched his hand, and smiled. "My father used to say the world still sings to those willing to listen, but some songs are meant to be carried in silence. I think you've found one of those." And at night, in the small hour when all the lanterns in Hobbiton had gone out, he would step outside with a cup of tea and sit beneath the stars. They looked different to him now. Not brighter exactly, but more present, like they saw him in return. Sometimes he thought he could feel the mountains still, far to the east, no longer whispering, but breathing in silence like a deep forest in winter. There was peace in that breath. And in his own chest, that same rhythm beat, quiet, strong, and steady. He didn't need to speak of what had passed. Some things were not meant for retelling. They were meant to be held, like warm stones in the palm, comforting in their weight. He would carry the mountain, not as a burden, but as part of him now, asher woven into the thread of who he was. As the weeks passed, Tomlo returned to his routines, tending to his small garden, mending the old fence, walking the woods in the early morning mist. But something had changed in how he moved through the world. He spoke less, but listened more. He began noticing the subtleties of silence, the gentle hush of leaves when the wind paused, the rhythm of raindrops tapping against his window, the quiet rustle of worms beneath the soil. He found meaning in the spaces between things. Neighbours who once called him restless now spoke of him as wise, though he had never claimed such a thing. Even the children began to sit a little longer when he told his simple stories. Not because of grand battles or dragons, but because of the quiet way he spoke of walking and listening, and letting the world rest in your bones. It had been many weeks since Tomlo returned from his journey beyond Mordor, and by now most of Hobbiton had ceased asking questions. The novelty of his absence and mysterious return had faded. replaced by the soothing rhythm of everyday life. But even in that quietness, something lingered. Something in the way he paused before speaking, or how he turned his head slightly, as if listening for something distant. He still laughed, still helped harvest apples and repair leaky thatch. But his laughter was softer now, like the whisper of wind through barley. The children began to follow him more often, curious not about monsters or swords, but about his long silences and the way he always seemed to hear something they could not. Tomlo never pretended to be wise, but others started treating him as if he were. Not because he said much, but because he didn't. When he sat by the Brandywine River, staring into the current with his arms folded across his knees, others would sometimes sit nearby and just be still with him. And somehow, that stillness spoke volumes. One day, an old gaffer asked him if he had seen elves on his journey. Tomlo looked toward the horizon, smiled faintly and said, "Not elves, just echoes." The gaffer, after blinking a few times, nodded solemnly, even though he didn't quite understand. For Tomlo had a way of speaking now that made one feel like meaning was present, even when it wasn't said aloud, like a story half remembered that still warms the heart. The quiet inside him had not faded. It had grown into something deeper, rooted like an old tree. Tomlo often wandered past his garden to the edge of Tookland, walking trails that twisted through forgotten groves and mossy stone walls. He began to notice things others missed, the way a branch bent slightly, as if bowing to the breeze, or how the crows paused their cawing when a storm approached. Sometimes he would stop entirely, not to rest, but to listen, not to sound, but to the space between sounds. The same space where once, high on the peak of Mount Doom, a voice had stirred the old fires. That place in his mind now felt sacred, like a small cave where memory rested beside understanding. He never tried to explain it. Some things were not meant for explaining. One morning, while sitting beneath an oak tree whose leaves had turned a soft amber, Tomlo was approached by a young hobbit named Merrill. She had eyes like morning frost and cheeks freckled from long hours in the sun. "Mr. Tomlo," she said gently, "is it true that mountains can talk?" Tomlo looked at her for a long moment, not with surprise, but with the deep awareness that her question came from something more than curiosity. Finally, he nodded and said, "Not all mountains, just the ones that remember." Merrill frowned thoughtfully. "And what do they remember?" she asked. Tomlo smiled, laying a hand on the warm earth beside him. "They remember everything we try to forget. And sometimes they whisper it back so it won't be lost." Merrill sat beside him after that, not asking anything more. Word spread quietly that Tomlo could hear things no one else could, not as a storyteller or a seer, but as a listener. Not the kind who eavesdropped or gossiped, but one who simply received what the world offered. Birds began landing near his windowsill in the early morning, singing without fear. Foxes passed through his garden without startling. Even the old trees in the woods near his home seemed to rustle more kindly when he passed beneath them. Folk said he had become half-root, a part of the land, like mushrooms after rain. A few scoffed, of course, especially those who prided themselves on practical matters. But even they admitted something about Tomlo was different now. He had gone far, they said, and come back carrying the shape of that journey in his silence. As autumn deepened and the harvest season waned, Tomlo found himself spending more time beneath the stars. He built a small bench on the hill above his burrow, where he could see the sky unfold each night, like a story without words. The stars, as always, offered no answers, only presence. But that was enough. Sometimes Merrill joined him, asking quiet questions about the moon or what he thought of dreams. Tomlo answered when he could, but more often he simply let her talk. It became clear that she too was beginning to sense the deeper quiet, the kind that doesn't fill silence but honors it. Others followed in time. A few neighbors brought him poems or letters to read, as if his silence gave weight to their words. He never offered critique, only the stillness in which their voices could echo back. By winter, the snow began to fall in gentle drifts across the Shire. Tomlo watched it gather along the low stone walls and the curls of his roof. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and he brewed tea that smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine. He sat by the fire with a notebook he barely used, writing only one line. The mountain no longer calls, but it listens still. He closed the book and set it on the shelf, not needing to write more. Stories, after all, are not always meant for reading. Sometimes they are meant to live quietly in the heart of a hobbit who once heard fire speak, and though he never again heard the voice of Mount Doom, Tomlo felt its breath in the quiet snow, in the hush of trees, and in the soft footsteps of those who would one day seek silence themselves. One late evening, while the first frost clung to the edge of his window panes, Tomlo heard something faint in the distance. Not a whisper, not a word, but the sensation of sound remembered. It came from the east, not from Mount Doom itself, but from the path he had once walked, the echo of footsteps across ancient ground. He did not fear it, nor did he feel summoned. Instead, he sat with it, letting the memory unfold like smoke from an old pipe. That moment reminded him, silence is not the absence of the past, but its presence reshaped. He thought then of Frodo, and of Sam, and all those who had walked great distances only to carry home something invisible. He understood now. The greatest burden was never the ring, but the memory of what it had touched. And even in peace, that memory remained. Winter in the Shire came not with storms or blizzards, but with quiet persistence. Layers of white drifting down until even the hedgerows bowed beneath the weight. The fields slept beneath their frost blankets, and the air held a stillness so deep it seemed the whole world had paused to listen. Tomlo, now silver at the edges and slower in his steps, welcomed the hush. His days were gentle and undisturbed, filled with simple routines. A morning cup of tea, a short walk to the hill, and quiet hours by the hearth. Visitors still came now and then. Merrill, older now and carrying books of her own, a young post-hobbit who liked to sit in silence near the fire. Even the occasional elf, pale and silent, pausing in passing to nod once to the hobbit, who knew how to listen without fear. Tomlo did not speak often anymore. Words, he believed, were like stones in a brook, best placed gently and only when needed. He no longer felt the ache of longing to explain the voice he had once heard. That moment on Mount Doom had become something sacred, part of him but not his to pass on. He sometimes dreamt of the fire, not the violence of its heat, but the rhythm of its breath. It no longer called to him. It didn't need to. Whatever business had once stirred in the belly of the mountain had quieted now. Its rage was long extinguished, and all that remained was the deep, ancient knowledge of stone resting after centuries of unrest. That knowing lived now not only in the earth, but in Tomlo too. The last time snow fell heavily that year, Tomlo did not rise early. He stayed beneath his thick woolen quilt, listening to the creak of the tree limbs beyond his window and the soft hush of snowfall on his roof. He wasn't sick, just tired in a way that felt old and whole. When he did rise, he moved slowly to the fire and lit it without hurry, watching the flames catch as if greeting an old friend. His hands, though warm, still moved with care as he prepared his breakfast and poured tea. Outside, the world was white and still, and for a long time, he stood watching the snow settle over his garden. No birds sang, no carts passed. It was a perfect silence, not empty, but full of presence. That day, Meryl came by as she often did, carrying a small parcel of dried berries and bread. She found Tomlo in his chair, gazing out the window with a peaceful expression. "I thought you might need something sweet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tomlo smiled and took her hand in his, not speaking, just holding her gaze for a long moment. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice gentle and short. They sat in silence for hours, sipping tea and watching the fire. And when Meryl left that evening, she paused at the door. "It feels like you're saying goodbye," she said. Tomlo nodded once. "Not goodbye, just settling." Meryl's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, kissed his brow, and stepped into the twilight, snow crunching softly underfoot. That night, Tomlo sat by the fire longer than usual, wrapped in a blanket and listening to the old rhythms, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against the window, the slow tick of the clock his father had built. In his heart, he felt a warmth that reached beyond the fire, a warmth that came from the earth itself, deep and eternal. Somewhere far away, the mountain slept, and he felt it sigh once, a long breath of stone finally at rest. He closed his eyes and remembered the path that had led him there. The black gate crumbled and silent, the wind atop Mount Doom, the voice that had called him not to destroy, but to remember. And he did. He remembered, and then he let the memory settle into peace. When morning came, the sun broke through the clouds, casting gold upon the white hills. Birds returned to the hedges, singing soft notes of early spring. But inside the small hobbit hole beneath the hill, Tomlo did not stir. His chair was empty now, the blanket folded neatly over the armrest, and the fire had gone out, leaving behind only gentle embers. There was no sorrow in the home, only stillness, and something tender that hung in the air like the memory of music. Meryl returned that day, sensing what had passed even before she stepped inside. She found his notebook untouched, the single line still resting where he had left it. The mountain no longer calls, but it listens still. She read it aloud, then closed the book and placed it gently beside the fire. Tomlo's passing was not marked by ceremony. No great songs were sung, and no banners hung in the streets. But the Shire felt it. In the days that followed, neighbors began to pause more often. At the river, in the fields, on the hillsides. They spoke less and listened more. The children, who had once run noisily through the lanes, now walked quietly past his garden, placing small stones or pine cones at his gate in silent tribute. Meryl took up tending his home, not as a shrine, but as a place where stillness could grow. She opened the window each morning, brewed his tea, and read his favorite books aloud into the quiet. Not for an audience, but for the air itself. For Tomlo had taught them something no one else had. That peace is not the absence of noise, but the presence of meaning. Years passed, and the story of Tomlo the listener became something half remembered, like a dream passed from one generation to the next. Some said he had once spoken with mountains. Others said he had simply walked far enough to hear the truth inside himself. But what everyone agreed on was this: he had changed the Shire, not with grand deeds, but with gentleness. Flowers bloomed a little brighter where he had walked, birds lingered longer on his windowsill, and in the evenings, when the stars came out, folk would sometimes climb the hill above his home, sit on the old bench and say nothing at all, just watching the sky and letting the world speak in silence. And far, far to the east, beneath layers of ash and ancient stone, Mount Doom remained. It no longer burned, no longer whispered, but deep in its roots, something had shifted. Something that remembered a small hobbit who had come not with anger, but with listening. The mountain, though silent, still listened, and sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the long plains of Mordor, it carried with it not the cry of war, but the echo of a soft voice saying nothing, and meaning everything. And so, the echoes fade into the gentle hush of night. The fire has long since settled into glowing embers, and the stars have quietly arranged themselves above the hills, as if listening too. Tomlo's story has come to rest, not with a loud end, but with a breath, a warmth, a knowing that lingers. You've walked with him, step by step, through quiet fields, through ancient ash, through silence that speaks more than sound ever could. And now, here at the close of the tale, there is nothing left to do but be still, still like the mountain, still like the snow, still like peace when it finally finds its way home. Let the story settle within you like a gentle stone sinking into soft earth. If you're already curled up in bed, let your thoughts float like lanterns down a quiet stream. There's no need to hold on to anything now. Let the world outside your window soften. Let the worries of the day lose their shape. Everything you need is right here, in the quiet of your breath, in the comfort of stillness, in the memory of a story that asked nothing of you except to listen. Just like Tomlo, you've heard the quiet fire beneath all things. And now it's time to drift gently into rest. May your dreams carry you far beyond the Shire, to places of soft magic and wordless wonder. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Cozy Storytime. If the story brought you calm or helped you feel held in the hush of night, consider subscribing and leaving a kind word below. We'll be back soon with more tales for gentle hearts, for dreamers, for those who love slow stories and soft endings. But for now, let your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts fade, and your breath bury you deeper into sleep. You're safe. You're home. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be kind.